Good afternoon. This is SJ with Commission Shift. I am opening up our Twitter space to talk about this morning's Railroad Commission oil and gas open meeting. And I'm going to wait for some staff to join us. And while they do, I can give a quick overview here. We're going to get into some of the agenda items that we've pulled out to talk about and some of the decisions that were made in the oil and gas open meeting today. As always, the Railroad Commission does have a monthly open meeting in Austin, and they stream it online. And these open meetings, for anyone that has listened in, you will know they go fast. We had over 300 items today, which is pretty typical. And it felt once again a little bit like an auctioneer as we moved through all of those items pretty quickly. So our attempt is to slow things down, talk about the ramifications of some of these decisions and what is going on to the best of our ability at the Railroad Commission and what they're doing with their order of business. So today we're going to talk a bit about no good faith claims against operators. There was 5 or 6 of those on the agenda this time around. There was also some discussion. So most of these agenda items are blanket approved. So there's no discussion for the benefit of listeners about those items. They've already been hashed out behind closed doors with administrative law judges who review, any of the paperwork and they make those decisions and then make recommendations to railroad commissioners, and commissioners either agree with those recommendations and approve the recommendation, or they deny it to send it back and things like that. So of the events today and of the agenda items, we did not see much discussion. There was some, however, around administrative matters, that section of the agenda, which includes pending or considered litigation against federal agencies over laws that the Railroad Commission feels that they have jurisdiction over in Texas. So there was some discussion there. We'll talk about that. And as always, there is a public input section of the agenda. And our executive director, Virginia Palacios, gave public input this time around. There was also public input from 3 other registered speakers. So we'll talk about their comments and give a recap there. So I am joined with some staff members. Hey, everyone. I'm going to send you requests to make sure that you can speak. And we'll kind of start at the top of the agenda. So that includes the oil and gas hearing division, where we saw item 29, and that was a specific complaint that was brought against an oil and gas operator, a complaint saying they don't have a good faith claim to operate. And this is a complaint brought by Laura Briggs, an impacted landowner in West Texas, and it's all taking place in Pecos County with some leases and wells on her land, on her property. Alyssa, our field organizer, is joining and has had a lot of conversations with Laura Briggs. And so, Alyssa, I'm hoping you can kind of give us some high-level summary of what's been going on with Laura Briggs since the last time we spoke to her. Can you give us sort of an overview about this case that was in front of the administrative law judges and the railroad commissioners today?
Yeah, so Laura has been dealing with some fraudulent operators. They have expired mineral leases with the mineral owner, and because of that, they should not be going in onto Laura's property to take take gas off of her property. And so she submitted a good faith claim, I believe, back in September. And unfortunately, the burden of proof was on Laura. And so she had to go dig and find information about these leases on her own time, with her own resources. And she provided the Railroad Commission with about 52 pages of information showing that there has not been any production reported, and even supplying a letter from Jetta, the mineral owner, that their lease is expired. And so what happened today was, as a part of these blanket approvals, from my understanding, right, that there's no good faith claim to those leases. The lease kind of falls onto the state's responsibility, and the state can't or won't really do anything until those leases or those that equipment causes a bigger problem, like they start leaking, or there's a blowout. So yeah, it's just like it's a very complicated and nuanced conversation with these good faith claims. Like, you can put out a good faith claim, and maybe the operator will be found to not have, claim to those leases, but there's not much else the Railroad Commission can do after that. Oh, hello.
Oh, sorry. The mute button is my enemy today. Thanks, Alyssa. So what you're saying, like, the Railroad Commission can at least, make a decision on the good faith claim. And this agenda item was under the blanket items that were a bunch of other items that were blanket approved. So can we take that to mean that the Railroad Commission is agreeing with Laura Briggs that the operators are not in compliance?
Yes, but another thing that I think is kind of being or kind of happening under the radar is like a P4 transfer. So it might be that that Arch Oil and Gas is going to sell off, this to someone else, and they'll still be able to like go in and take gas from that property. It's just like it's not enforceable. Like, they can only say, yeah, there's no good faith claim, and that's it. Like, it stops there. There's no enforcement. There's no like remediation to the problem.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is you're saying that these operators, and this is like a pattern that's happened in the past, they can transfer their lease to a friend or, another operator,
or even themselves. Like, they can
under a different like business name, an LLC. Okay. Yeah. And so they're continuing to juggle around the paperwork to keep their access open as much as they can. And then, but what they're reporting to the Railroad Commission is that these are essentially inactive wells. That's what the Railroad Commission is hearing from them, right?
Right.
Okay, so that's also a discrepancy because they are removing product, they're removing oil and gas, but that's not being officially reported, which is another huge compliance issue. So, wow. And I mean, if the Railroad Commission, Alyssa, if you can answer this, like, if the Railroad Commission was a more proactive agency, how should they be dealing with out of compliance banned operators that are bad actors like this?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of like circled around this in one of our past Twitter spaces, but like really, and this is from my perspective, what really needs to happen is more, I think that they need to work with local sheriffs to enforce against bad actors. And I mean, if they are stealing from Jeddah, Jeddah could, sue those operators and say, hey, like, they're not reporting, but they are taking our minerals, and, what can we do from there, right? So I think, just from, again, my perspective, what really needs to happen is that the RRC needs to work very closely with the sheriffs, to make sure that it's more than just bark, it's bite too, when these operators are found doing something bad.
It also seems that there's an opportunity on the policy side for the Railroad Commission to have stricter standards
Hmm.
for permitting leases.
Yeah,
So we have that P5 form, which is what every operator has to have and renew every year to stay, in compliance with the Railroad Commission. And if you are, you know, if you are out of compliance so many times, and if you are able to track that someone is just transferring their lease to themselves under a different name, that should be grounds to not have your permit reissued
hmm,
either. It seems that the Railroad Commission is fast to say their hands are tied or it's out of their jurisdiction. But once again, it just seems that like they could be more stringent in approving
yeah,
people instead of waiting until the worst case scenario happens. They could be more proactive in preventing operators from getting a hold of these leases in the first place, especially if they have a history.
absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. So, I also want to kind of talk about inactive versus well, like a plugged well, because I know that that's something on the claim. Laura Briggs would like to see these wells on her property plugged.
Hmm.
Can you talk about why a landowner would want to a well plugged instead of left inactive?
So I think, first and foremost, like, it's a major safety issue. I think Laura, she posted a picture of one of the wells on her property with her dogs nearby it. And so if anything were to happen, like, that's family, that could potentially be harmed by that. So by plugging a well, you completely cap it, you cement it, and it's no longer accessible. The risk for a blowout or some leaks are greatly minimized. And yeah, I think it's really like a safety, a peace of mind kind of thing, for the landowners. Now, specifically in Laura's case, like, she's dealing with some, pretty interesting folks. And so like, they can go onto her property whenever they want and, say, well, we're just here to get our stuff, and it's just not, it's not, especially if you have children around, if you have livestock, stuff like that. Like, you don't want things to be taken from you without your consent. And that's kind of what's been happening.
Yeah. I also could see this as an opportunity, again, talking about being proactive. If a well is on the record as inactive, but we have these operators that are still eking out, making marginal profits off of something that's
Hmm.
not being reported, you by leaving the well unplugged, then you're allowing that to continue. And by
Exactly.
leaving a well unplugged, even if it's actually inactive or marginally producing, some tiny amount, like you said, like time passes and those can only become more dangerous.
Right.
So the sooner you plug, right, the sooner you nip this in the bud.
Exactly.
Okay, well, hopefully there's going to be more enforcement, but also I would love to see as we go on the Railroad Commission being way more proactive in who they award P5s to, and also, applying more scrutiny on lease transfers,
Hmm.
because that is something I think Commission Shift has pointed out time and time again, that the more we lease transfers happen, the more a well is transferred, the more the odds that it becomes abandoned increase, right?
Absolutely.
So that's another place I think that a stronger oversight agency could achieve so much more.
Yeah.
Um, So Alyssa, thanks for some of that overview and that insight. I want to also talk about a few of these other agenda items. I mentioned at the top administrative matters. We did have some discussion, at least, or comments from the commissioners about some pending things. One of the things includes the new EPA methane rule that was passed December 2nd. And we didn't have anything concrete happen today with the Railroad Commission. They're still looking at that rule, but I think we should talk about what's in it or what we know about the methane rule and maybe some of their comments about it. Dr. Reyes, our deputy director, is here. I'm so glad you could join us. Dr. Reyes, maybe you could kind of talk us through that section of the agenda and what you heard today. Oh, hopefully you are able to speak. I'm not sure if you... Yep. Are you there, Dr. Reyes? Okay. I think we're having some issues hearing you. I don't know if it's just on my end or if our other listeners can hear you, Dr. Reyes, but I'm not hearing anything coming through. Can anyone hear Dr. Reyes, or is it just me?
No, I'm not hearing anything come through.
Okay. Okay. Well, while we figure out our sound glitch, sorry about that. I will move on to public input and talk a little bit about some of our public input speakers, and then maybe we can figure out the sound here in a second. So under public input, there were 4 registered speakers, and I just want to quickly sort of summarize what we heard from them. Skylar White spoke. Skylar is an impacted landowner as well. He lives close to Laura Briggs out in Pecos County. He has over, I believe, 200 legacy wells on his land, and he has had a lot of problems from them, a lot of leaks and blowouts. And so he is a regular voice at these open meetings. And I think he gives a lot of really effective comments. This time he brought photos, and he also talked about bad operators, and he compared them to wet and dry cows. You can tell if a cow has milk just by looking at them. Apparently, this is some West Texas rancher lexicon that I am learning. But he says you can separate them just by looking at them, and he says bad operators are the same. So he called on the Railroad Commission again to do that scrutiny and do that due diligence, and not just treat all operators the same, because you can really see the bad actors, and they shouldn't be given so many chances. So Skylar White making that observation. He also spoke about wells on his property that are being plugged, and it seems that the way they're being classified as orphaned or not is a little gray right now. They are wells that are technically not on the orphaned well list, but the Railroad Commission is plugging them. And so Skylar is saying, what are you doing? Are you going to collect money from these operators since they are not technically orphaned? Or are you going to add them to the list if you are actually going to use the Orphaned Well Fund money to plug them? So he's asking for some more transparency about those wells. Feel free to jump in if you heard other things, but I think those were some of the highlights from Skylar. Another speaker was Cyrus Reed. Cyrus is with the Sierra Club, and he spoke in favor of the methane rule that the EPA recently passed. and this kind of goes into the administrative matters section. But basically, Cyrus came in support of the methane rule. He called methane a climate cooker. And he says that releases from methane, in addition to being a greenhouse gas, are also associated with volatile organic compounds, those are VOCs, that do affect community health. He says that this rule will not shut down the industry. And in fact, in New Mexico, there has been similar rules. There's been stricter rules than Texas applied in New Mexico, and they haven't seen the industry shut down. So he's calling it not an anti-industry rule. It is an anti-pollution rule. So full comments from Cyrus Reed are going to be posted, I think, on once the Railroad Commission posts their recording of the open meeting. So I think folks should definitely listen to those. One of the last speakers was Commission Shifts Virginia Palacios, and she gave sort of a Railroad Commission in review recap as her comments, sort of summarizing what this year has brought and some of the highlights from the Railroad Commission. And in that, she did give kudos on a few things. She says, with language access, the Railroad Commission has begun to release more information in Spanish and not just English. But there is definitely room for improvement, and we would like to see much more information accessible in Spanish in the year to come, as well as providing interpretation services at these open meetings. Other areas for improvement are pretty much across the board. A lot of areas the Railroad Commission oversees, we didn't see them work with our requests or with other suggestions. So that includes categories of orphaned wells, carbon dioxide injection rules, public engagement, monitoring and enforcement plan, the draft of the waste pit rule, and pipeline safety. So there's major areas that we want to see more responsiveness from the Railroad Commission in terms of how they engage with feedback. I think in particular, Virginia also pointed out this whole question of barred operators. Again, which sort of connects to Laura Briggs's case. There is a long list of barred operators that have leases on wells that are inactive according to Railroad Commission records, but they're not on the orphaned well list. So what are we doing with this category of barred operators owning leases to wells? Are they going to plug them if they're barred operators, if they're out of compliance? Should they not be added? Should those wells not be added to the orphaned well list? This is a question the Commission Shift has brought before the Railroad Commission, and we haven't received any answers yet. So those were some of the things that Virginia pulled for her comments. And once again, she was thanked for making comments, but there was no engagement after her comments. So I think that is some highlights from the public input section. Dr. Reyes, how is your sound? Can we hear you, or can you try to make a comment now to see if your sound comes through? Let's see. I just sent you another invite to speak, so hopefully that will give you the option to turn on.
Can you hear me?
I can hear
Yay.
you. Thank you so much for joining. So thanks for bearing through that glitch earlier. It's good to have your voice with us now. And I want to circle back to that part of the agenda under administrative matters. There were a few things, but I think the one that we've all been following is the EPA rule. Can you talk about what you heard today from the Railroad Commissioners about that?
Definitely. This is a great moment to look at how we as citizens have set up government to work. And so in the state of Texas, we have a culture where we distrust the federal government. And the Railroad Commission very much follows this belief. And so when the federal government comes up with a methane rule that is going to force industry to lower emissions, well, we automatically react as if they're trying to expand their authority. And instead of informing themselves, I don't know if anyone was watching, but if you didn't, go watch again. The commissioners have not read the rule, but they were making blanket statements against it. And so that is why the Sierra Club member Cyrus came up and said, don't do that. Go read the rule and first understand how it directly affects us. And he clarified that forcing industry to lower emissions had to do with global warming. And that's why he called it, what did he call it?
A climate cooker.
A climate cooker. And so he's bringing attention to the intent behind the law. And the intent behind the law isn't to hurt industry. It is to help us survive a little bit longer. Because one of the things that is happening is that global warming is reducing our ability to sustain life. So it's not just about extreme weather. That's just a symptom of the global warming. But those extreme weathers are going to result in drought. They are going to result in less food for us. They are going to result in more demand of energy because we cannot, take the heat. And so it is something that we don't have a choice, but we have to address. And the reduction of emissions is just but one aspect, one way that we can address it. And it's asking industry to be more responsible, better neighbors, better, better practitioners of their profession. Why is it so hard for the commission to demand excellence or higher standards from industry when industry is capable of doing it? So that is just one aspect of the methane rule. And so what they do during this space in the meeting is update the commissioners on the lawsuits that the state of Texas through the Railroad Commission may be doing against the federal government authority. But it is super important for us to understand the intent behind this. So my next question for anyone listening, if you are a Texan, is I am with you. I wholeheartedly believe that we can fix it ourselves. And so the next question should be for each one of us. Then what are we willing to do for us on our own to reduce emissions? And that's when it becomes so difficult, so overburdened, that we are going to have to realize that we need some type of collaboration and support from the collective, which in this case is the federal government. Because we need to remember that the federal government is us, the collective, the union with all the states. And so, I just wanted to take that. I also wanted to bring back this idea of, because it also, I am about pointing the responsibility that each one of us has when it comes to creating the government we do have. What we see is what we have created. And each one of us, you cannot wash your hands, okay? I want you to be aware of that. But when we're thinking in terms of, the Railroad Commission has no authority to address whether there can be exchange of entities with some operators and therefore they continue to operate badly, we need to ask ourselves, what is the role of government in our society? And in Texas, we want it to be limited. We want it to only be there to help business. And so maybe we need to start reconsidering what we want the role of government to be. And once we reconsider that, we're going to have to start demanding the laws that reshape that government to have the authority that now we need, because no one has been policing this industry and our natural resources, and now the beauty of our land and the health of Texans is being affected, especially because the Railroad Commission does not take it upon themselves, unless it is to benefit the industry, to do something about it.
Right. And Commission Shift has gone on record to say that we would like to see the Railroad Commission step up when it comes to admissions. Emissions, we see them every month give exceptions to operators asking to flare more than the allowed amount, and they hand those exception requests out very willingly. And so we would like to see the Railroad Commission take the reins and be part of that solution of limiting emissions. But since they haven't done it, we do support an agency like the EPA issuing a rule. But I have a question about, well, who is ensuring that the Railroad Commission will enforce the new methane rule? I mean, they're already saying they're not happy with it without having read it. So who's overseeing the overseers?
This is going to come down from the federal government's authority changing the standards. And so this is the challenge inside environmental policy. We don't have environmental police. No one gets arrested unless there is some kind of tragic accident where millions of dollars were lost and some hundreds of people died, right? Then they try to make someone responsible. But there is no policing in terms of enforcement of law. So in great instances, then it becomes criminal law, negligence, right? But for the most part, if they say to a company, hey, you shouldn't emit this much more, right? All they do is fine them. So if the company has enough money, they're going to be okay with being fined.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to make sure that these rules have teeth. And you often hear that in policy analysis, right? Does the policy have teeth? And what they mean is, can we actually enforce the standards we are establishing? And so we're going to have to read that rule to kind of understand what kind of teeth it was given.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also important to understand that these standards are not just for the United States. You know how the commissioner today talked about Venezuela and talked about, I'm sorry, I'm making that voice, but you know, he was trying to say that if the United States cannot, you know, have better relationships with these other countries who are, according to him, contaminating more, that they shouldn't expect it of us. And I mean, please listen to that standard. You know, don't ask us to behave if you're not asking others to behave. I don't even know where that rationalization comes from, but it's very sad. But anyway, these standards are going to be global. It is an agreement that has a human race we are taking upon ourselves to follow in order to, once again, enhance the possibility of survivability. And so it is crazy that we're even asking ourselves, why are we doing this?
Right. The stakes are very high.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. So what we do know is the Railroad Commission's staff will be reviewing this law, and they will probably make some determinations that we'll hear about in future open meetings. And we'll be listening, as always, to hear what their next steps are and following along with everyone else. And we want to keep that pressure on, though, that we are following, we do care, and we want to see enforcement with teeth when it comes to something like greenhouse gas emissions. So Dr. Reyes, thanks for helping me summarize that and giving us some of that context. The next open meeting, this is important, is in 2024 at the end of January. So January 30th is a Tuesday, and that's when the Railroad Commission will be meeting again. That's Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. And we'll be back then to live stream that meeting and do our live tweets. And we'll schedule another discussion as well. In the meantime, if folks have questions, we do encourage you to reach out. We're on social media at Commission Shift, and our website is commissionship.org. And, once again, we're the only organization in Texas that is solely focused on reforming the Railroad Commission and transforming our oil and gas oversight to be more beneficial to the people and places of Texas. So give us a follow, and we'll see you back in January with more updates. And thanks again to the staff that joined me today to help recap this latest open meeting. We'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.